Between elites and poverty, between Chinese capital and local societies, there stands one actor whose role is both central and deeply contradictory: the state, the government, the administrative apparatus, ministries, agencies, regulatory offices. These institutions sign the agreements, they accept the loans, they decide where roads, ports, power plants, and housing districts will be built. And at least in theory, they are meant to protect the public interest. In practice, African states have entered a position they have never experienced at this scale before. On one side lies the pressure of development. Young societies demand jobs, electricity, housing, and transportation. On the other side stand global financial flows offering fast solutions, infrastructure loans, turnkey projects, foreign contractors arriving with their own equipment, their own technology, and their own construction schedules. For many governments, this looks like an answer to multiple problems at once. Roads can be built in years rather than decades. Ports can rise faster than local companies could manage on their own. Power plants can be activated without waiting for domestic private capital. Yet, this speed comes at a price, and that price is not always written into official contracts. The state becomes an intermediary between foreign capital and society. But very often, it also becomes a beneficiary of this position. Ministers, senior officials, political networks surrounding those in power gain access to projects that represent not only development, but enormous streams of money. Infrastructure contracts are not neutral. They generate entire ecosystems of interest. Whoever determines the route of a highway determines land prices. Whoever selects the contractor controls commission flows. Whoever approves the loan shapes the future fiscal obligations of the state. Across many African countries, Chinese projects have become catalysts for a new style of politics, one in which elections are not won through social programs, but through promises of concrete infrastructure. We will build a road. We will construct a port. We will bring investment. These slogans work because infrastructure is visible. Concrete, asphalt, and cranes are more tangible than education reform or healthcare restructuring. The problem is that infrastructure built under political pressure often grows faster than the institutions meant to regulate it. Roads appear without maintenance strategies. Ports operate without locally trained management cadres. Power plants function without long-term energy planning. And the state is left holding debt. Infrastructure loans are politically convenient. They produce immediate visual success. They allow governments to demonstrate achievement, but repayment stretches across decades. Successive administrations inherit obligations that narrow their economic and political maneuvering space. This creates a new form of dependency, not colonial in the classical sense, not military, but financial and infrastructural. A state servicing massive loans must maintain favorable relations with creditors. It must renegotiate terms. It must sometimes compromise in unrelated areas of foreign policy. This influence is rarely written explicitly into contracts, yet it exists in real diplomatic relationships. At the same time, governments face pressure from infrastructure elites, the actors who profit directly from project flows. These individuals finance political campaigns, cultivate ties with decision-makers, lobby for additional contracts, and construct ecosystems in which development becomes a self-reproducing contract machine. Within this system, the public interest often slips into the background. Schools attract less media attention than bridges. Hospitals appear less spectacular than skyscrapers. Institutional reforms generate fewer headlines than highways. As a result, many governments choose projects that look impressive in photographs but fail to address deep structural social problems. Perhaps the most dramatic consequence is that the state increasingly loses its role as neutral arbiter and becomes a player seated on one side of the table. Instead of mediating between society and capital, it begins co-creating systems that favor wealth concentration. This erodes public trust. Citizens see new roads but not better living standards. They see new government buildings but not improved public services. They see foreign delegations but not investment in their own neighborhoods. Cynicism grows. The sense spreads that the state no longer represents citizens, but rather acts as a broker of competing interests. At this point, another risk emerges: political stability. When growth depends heavily on foreign projects and loans, any slowdown in investment directly impacts national budgets. Tax revenues fall, unemployment rises, funding for public services shrinks. This creates fertile ground for protest movements, populism, and radical political currents. The paradox is that infrastructure designed to stabilize states can sometimes destabilize them. It creates expectations that existing systems cannot fulfill. New roads inflate land prices. New ports attract speculation. New business districts push poorer communities toward the periphery, and governments find themselves trapped between debt obligations, political stability, and social pressure. China's cooperation model with Africa often bypasses traditional political conditionality mechanisms. It does not demand governance reform. It does not impose systemic change requirements. It focuses on projects. This is frequently perceived as an advantage: sovereignty, non-interference, partnership without moral lecturing. But there is another side to this arrangement. Without reform pressure, institutional weaknesses remain unresolved. Corruption persists, nepotism survives, weak oversight mechanisms continue to operate, and money flows faster than state capacity to manage it transparently. This creates an environment in which infrastructure expansion and governance pathologies grow side by side. The state becomes a battleground for access to projects. Ministries compete for contracts. Regions compete for investment. Political parties compete for control over funding streams. In this chaos, it becomes easy to forget that the fundamental purpose of development should be improving the lives of the majority. This episode, therefore, does not portray the state as either villain or savior. It presents the state as an institution under pressure, pressured by societies demanding rapid progress, pressured by foreign capital seeking stable investment conditions, pressured by elites determined to preserve privilege. And this is why what happens next depends on a single question: will the state become the architect of development or merely its notary? If it remains a notary, it will simply sign agreements designed by others. If it becomes an architect, it must confront elites, renegotiate power structures, and place social interest above short-term political spectacle. And this leads us to the final act of this story, because in the end, this is no longer only about elites, the middle class, and poverty. It is about the future of an entire continent. Will Africa build its own development model? Or will it remain a playing field for external strategies? Will infrastructure become a tool of emancipation or another mechanism of dependency? When evening falls over African megacities, thousands of lights appear across skylines. Highway traffic does not stop. Advertising screens flash promises of modernity. And a question emerges, one absent from investment presentations but present in everyday conversations. Does this light represent a real future, or merely reflect the ambitions of others? The African dream of the 21st century no longer resembles the independence dreams of the 1960s. Then, the struggle centered on flags, anthems, and formal sovereignty. Today, the struggle is far more complex. It concerns Africa's position within global production systems, technological networks, and capital flows. It asks whether the continent will become a creator of value, or remain a supplier of land, labor, and raw materials. At the center of this conflict stands a class structure shaped by Chinese investment and global financial currents. Infrastructure elites, debt-driven middle classes, and systemic poverty are not separate worlds. They form a single mechanism, one that can produce emancipation or generate new dependency. The greatest risk of this era is that Africa becomes a continent of modern facades and old power structures, fast roads combined with slow social mobility, massive ports alongside fragile local businesses, expanding cities where most residents remain on the margins. This is the class trap of development. It does not arise from lack of investment. It emerges when investment fails to transform power relations. Money circulates within closed loops, linking governments, elites, and foreign partners. The broader population receives fragments, temporary construction jobs, and promises of future prosperity. Yet history is not finished. Across African cities, alternative models are beginning to grow. Small, chaotic, imperfect, but real. Technology startups founded by young entrepreneurs, local solar energy initiatives, agricultural cooperatives bypassing intermediaries, digital platforms connecting producers directly with markets. These projects lack the spectacle of ports and railways, but they build genuine middle classes based on skills rather than debt. They generate jobs that survive beyond construction cycles. The problem is that such initiatives rarely receive the same support as mega projects. Banks prefer financing concrete over innovation risk. Governments prefer ribbon-cutting ceremonies to education reform. Politicians prefer quick victories to long-term institutional change. In this sense, Africa's future is not decided only in Beijing, Washington, or Brussels. It unfolds inside municipal offices, vocational schools, startup incubators, and neighborhoods absent from investment maps. The key question is whether African states can shift development logic from project-driven to structural. Projects impress. Structures determine who accesses capital, who can open businesses, who receives credit, who controls land, who advances socially. Without institutional reform, even the largest investments will merely rearrange luxury boundaries without dismantling inequality foundations. China also faces its own strategic choice. It can remain an infrastructure partner building export corridors, or it can evolve into an industrial and technological partner co-creating local value chains. The difference between these models is enormous. One produces dependency, the other produces interdependence. One strengthens intermediary elites, the other can empower local producers. One deepens class divisions, the other can gradually reduce them, but this outcome does not depend solely on China. It depends on whether African governments negotiate firmly, think strategically, and invest in domestic capacity. The greatest danger of this era is not foreign capital. It is the absence of a domestic vision. Without vision, every investment becomes someone else's instrument. Today, African cities display two simultaneous movements. One rises upward, towards skyscrapers, gated communities, and global standards. The other spreads sideways and downward into informal settlements, internal migration, and survival economies. Between them stands a generation of young people, the largest in the continent's history, better educated than ever before, connected to the global world through the internet, yet often excluded from real upward mobility. They will determine whether the African dream becomes reality. Not contract elites, not foreign investors, not PowerPoint presentations. The decision will be made by people standing in traffic, working in project offices, selling goods on the streets, learning programming in small co-working spaces, and building micro-enterprises in districts invisible from airport terminals. Africa can become a continent of competence-based middle classes rooted in technology and local capital. Or it can remain a continent of wealth islands surrounded by oceans of poverty. It can use Chinese investment as a springboard, or it can become trapped in a modernized version of old dependency. For now, city lights shine brighter every night, but the final question remains stark and unavoidable. Does this light illuminate a shared future, or merely deepen the shadow in which most of society still stands? Two Africas. One choice. When night falls across the continent, Africa resembles a constellation map. From above, clusters of light surround ports, capitals, and new business districts. Highways glow like energy veins. Airports pulse with movement. From this perspective, everything looks like success, proof that Africa has finally entered the global spotlight as market, partner, and future frontier. Yet just kilometers away, beyond drone cameras and investor brochures, another night unfolds, without electricity, without air conditioning, without stability. There, people fall asleep not thinking about tomorrow's business meetings, but wondering whether work will exist tomorrow. whether water will last, whether food prices will rise again. In this contrast lies the essence of the story of China, Africa, poverty, middle classes, and wealth. This is not a tale of one villain and one hero. It is the story of a system producing two speeds of development, a world that builds modernity with one hand while preserving inequality with the other. Throughout this episode, we have watched new elites emerge, debt-based middle classes expand, poverty pushed outside development maps, states balancing between social interests and foreign capital, and futures splitting into divergent paths. One scenario depicts Africa as the world's logistical backyard, a continent of ports, transit corridors, and externally managed industrial zones, supplying cheap labor and raw materials, while elites profit from mediation and most citizens remain in informal economies. The second scenario presents Africa as co-creator, building not only infrastructure but skills, not only attracting capital but generating it, not only exporting resources but processing them locally, not only consuming technology but developing it. The difference between these futures does not depend on whether roads and ports exist. Both scenarios include them. The difference lies in ownership, management, and long-term benefit distribution. True power in the 21st century is not about controlling territory. It is about controlling processes, supply chains, financial systems, data flows, technologies, education networks. Africa now stands at the crossroads of these processes. It holds demographic strength, urban growth, and global market access. Yet it also faces institutional weakness, social inequality, and the long shadow of dependency. China is part of this story, but not its sole author. It accelerates transformations that would occur anyway, though more slowly. Responsibility does not lie on one side alone. Even the largest investor cannot build healthy systems where states fail to regulate and strategize, and no country can build modern economies while isolating itself from global capital flows. Therefore, the real question is not whether China is good or bad for Africa. That question is too simple, too comfortable. The real question is whether Africa will seize this historical moment when it has become not a peripheral region, but a global node connecting trade, technology, finance, and politics. For the first time in decades, Africa is not standing at the margins of the world map. It stands at the intersection, and intersections create opportunity and danger. The most dramatic aspect is that the outcome does not depend only on governments and elites. It depends on millions of individual decisions, on whether young people gain education that builds real competence rather than symbolic diplomas, on whether entrepreneurs access financing that enables production rather than brokerage, on whether civil society gains strength to hold power accountable. These processes are quiet, invisible from satellites, impossible to celebrate with ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Yet they determine whether city lights represent transformation or decoration. In the silent night above African metropolises, another rhythm is visible: movement. Workers returning home, motorcycles delivering food, buses packed with commuters. This is the continent's real pulse, not from conference halls, but from streets. And it is there, within everyday life, that the future will be decided. Whether children from poor districts gain access to globally competitive education. Whether middle classes stop living on credit and begin building real capital. Whether elites invest in long-term development instead of short-term contracts. No investment bank report will answer these questions. Time will. For now, Africa stands between two worlds. One it knows well: dependency, cheap labor exports, inequality, and one still emerging: technology, local entrepreneurship, and new economic identity. This is not an ending. It is a moment of choice. And perhaps that is why this story matters. Because it is not only about Africa. It is about the architecture of the 21st century global order. Whether humanity has learned from colonial history or simply replaced old tools with new ones. Tomorrow morning, the sun will rise again. Ports will reopen, offices will fill, Informal settlements will wake, everything will appear normal. Yet beneath daily routine will pulse the final question we leave behind. Will Africa become the place where the future is produced, or merely the place through which the future passes in shipping containers? And this question does not concern only one continent. It concerns the world we are building,